There are people who can tell you, "I love you," as easily as they can ignore you later. They may be physically present, but emotionally absent. And sometimes, the most painful thing isn't the sting of rejection, but the silence of someone who no longer cares. This is the invisible trap in many relationships, believing that affection is still alive just because the words say so, when in truth, the actions have already let it die. Behind that confusion lies a quiet kind of suffering, a form of emotional hunger disguised as normality. We've all felt that disconnection at some point. Maybe with an adult child who no longer asks how you're doing, with a partner who's become indifferent, or with a friend who only shows up when it suits them. And yet, we keep looking for signs where there are none, justifying empty gestures, afraid to admit that maybe the love we gave wasn't returned. But there is a way out of that fog. Recognizing the signs of disinterest isn't an act of coldness, it's an act of self-respect. Because seeing clearly what the other person doesn't give also allows us to decide, with dignity, what we will continue to give ourselves. If this is your first time here, my name is Gabriel, and in this space, we talk about psychology and Stoic wisdom applied to emotional life. Not to harden the heart, but to learn how to care for it without depending on what others do or fail to do. I invite you to stay until the end and subscribe if you feel these reflections resonate with you right now. Stay because the last sign, the brightest one of all, will not only reveal who doesn't care about you, but also how to recognize those who truly do. Let's begin. There's a kind of emptiness that makes no noise, yet you can feel it. It's when you speak and the other person doesn't listen, when you share something important and they respond with a distracted "oh," when your words seem to bounce off an invisible wall. Disinterest doesn't always show up as rejection. It often hides behind routine, tiredness, or busyness. But deep down, the body senses it. Something inside shrinks, cools down, and you start to wonder if maybe you're asking for too much. Recognizing that feeling isn't weakness, it's sensitivity. Disinterest hurts because it reminds us that the bond has become one-sided, that the other person's soul no longer walks alongside ours. So far, we've talked about how that disinterest is a quiet form of detachment, but it's important to understand that it doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes people don't know how to sustain emotional presence, not because they don't value you, but because they're trapped in their own emptiness. Still, the key difference lies in intention. Those who care try to reconnect, those who don't settle into the distance. And that settling, that lack of curiosity about how you're doing, that failure to meet your eyes when you speak, is the clearest proof of genuine disinterest. I remember one afternoon years ago when I was talking for several minutes with someone who meant a lot to me. I was sharing something deeply troubling, something that kept me awake at night. When I finished, they looked up from their phone and said, "Sorry, what did you say?" That tiny phrase split my perception of our relationship in two. I realized that affection isn't measured by the words we say, but by the attention we give. Since then, I've learned that listening is an act of love, and when someone stops doing it, they're choosing to walk away. Disinterest also shows up in the smallest gestures, in the lack of follow-up to a conversation, in forgetting what you said just days ago, in the absence of curiosity about your projects. It's not about demanding constant attention, but about noticing whether there's genuine presence or just social obligation. Because when someone truly cares, their attention isn't sporadic. It's a thread that holds, even if it's thin, yet steady. Stoicism teaches that we can't control how much someone loves or listens to us, but we can choose how much value we give our own voice. Epictetus said that dignity begins when we stop begging for what we naturally deserve. And that's the essence of this first sign. When you notice disinterest, instead of insisting, observe. not to judge, but to decide whether you want to keep giving energy to someone who no longer gives it back. Sometimes, realizing that someone no longer cares about us is a form of liberation. It hurts, but it clarifies. It allows us to refocus on those who are still there, those who don't need to be asked for attention to offer it. That clarity is the first step toward inner peace, accepting absence without turning it into punishment. And from that acceptance, we open the door to the next level of understanding, when the relationship isn't just indifferent, but also unbalanced, when one person gives everything while the other only takes. Love, friendship, or any emotional bond rests on an invisible balance, giving and receiving. When that balance breaks, something essential fades away. There are relationships where one person gives time, attention, and care, while the other simply holds out their hand. At first, we justify it. They're going through a tough time. I'm just more patient. They'll come around. But over time, the lack of reciprocity becomes clear, not because we expect rewards, but because the energy no longer flows both ways. A heart that only gives ends up exhausted, and that exhaustion has a name: abandonment disguised as devotion. So far, we've seen how disinterest feels like emotional absence. Now, lack of reciprocity is something more. It's active disconnection, the effort of one person that the other lets fall to the ground. It's sending messages that go unanswered, caring without being cared for, offering understanding and finding no echo. The hardest part is that this pattern can last for years, especially when guilt or fear of loss keeps it alive. But the truth is, love doesn't mean draining yourself to keep someone else standing. Reciprocity isn't a demand, it's a form of respect. I once heard a simple metaphor that sums it up perfectly. Love is like a shared garden. If only one person waters it, the other may enjoy the flowers, but never learns the value of water. Some people get used to receiving without giving, not out of malice, but out of comfort. The problem is that in the process, the bond stops being a meeting and becomes consumption. And no one can sustain a healthy relationship if they're always paying the emotional cost for both. From a Stoic perspective, Seneca reminded us that those who give without measure reap not gratitude, but expectation. How often we've mistaken generosity for obligation. When we give more than we can sustain, without limits, we don't just lose energy, we also teach the other person that they can take without giving back. Breaking that cycle takes courage because it means admitting that what we give with love won't always be valued as we hope. Psychology confirms this too. Unbalanced relationships create anxiety because the human brain needs signs of reciprocity to feel safe. When it doesn't receive them, it interprets danger, abandonment, and lack of belonging. That state pushes us to give even more, exactly the opposite of what would actually help us heal. That's why the first step is to stop the impulse to give automatically. Observe whether the other person also cares, asks, and expresses gratitude, not to keep score, but to understand whether there's truly a we or just a me holding everything together. When you stop expecting reciprocity from someone who doesn't know how to give it, you begin to find it elsewhere, in self-care, in genuine friendships, in the silence that makes space for what truly nourishes you. Sometimes, losing an unequal relationship means gaining balance. It's like letting go of a rope that was only burning your hands. And in that act of letting go, another sign becomes just as clear. When words are plentiful, but actions don't follow. Because someone who says, "I love you," but doesn't act like it, is also showing that they don't really care about you. Some people build castles out of words but leave them empty. They say, "I'll call you, you can count on me, it won't happen again." And their voice sounds sincere. But time tells another story. Promises without action are the most elegant form of disinterest. They create the illusion of intention without commitment. They keep us waiting, suspended in a maybe that never happens. And as days pass, that maybe becomes a quiet emotional burden. You begin to lose trust, not only in the other person, but also in your own judgment. Up to this point, we've seen how disinterest and lack of reciprocity show up as emotional disconnection. But the inconsistency between what someone says and what they do brings another kind of confusion, hope. Because you want to believe that this time it'll be different, that they've finally understood. However, as Marcus Aurelius taught, words without action are smoke. Only conduct reveals the truth of the soul. Promises that go unfulfilled eventually drain trust. And when trust disappears, what remains isn't love, it's habit. I remember a short but telling story. A man promised his mother he would visit her every Sunday. At first he did, but over time, the excuses began. She never complained. She just kept preparing coffee each week. One day he arrived and found the cup untouched on the table. In that silence, he understood that broken promises don't just hurt the other person, they make them get used to your absence. Sometimes those who promise and don't follow through don't mean to cause pain. They simply don't understand the weight of their word. But the result is the same. The bond breaks. Stoicism reminds us that coherence is the heart of integrity. Epictetus insisted that true inner strength is shown by doing what you say, even when no one is watching. That principle applies to relationships too. Someone who cares about you doesn't need to remind you how much. They show it through their actions, not their words. If someone promises to support you but disappears when things get hard, it's not forgetfulness. It's a lack of emotional commitment. Psychologically, empty promises create what's known as intermittent reinforcement, a pattern of alternating hope and disappointment. It's addictive because the brain clings to the few times the promise was actually kept, hoping they'll happen again. But in truth, that only prolongs the pain. That's why recognizing inconsistency isn't coldness, it's emotional maturity. It means accepting that someone who doesn't back up their words with action has already made a choice, even if they haven't said it out loud. The Stoic way to respond isn't to complain or dramatize, but to observe and adjust, to appreciate the lesson that someone else's inconsistency brings, and to learn to keep your own word regardless of theirs. In the end, that's what preserves dignity. The ability to stay true to what you promise, even when no one else does. Before we continue, I want to take a brief moment to thank you for being here. If this content is helping you see your relationships more clearly, I invite you to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment with your name and country. I love knowing where this community is joining from and reading how each reflection resonates with you. Tell me, too, if there's another sign you'd add to this list. I promise to read every message carefully because this space is built with you. Let's get back to it. There's an even more painful form of indifference, not the one you see in broken promises, but the coldness in someone's response to your pain. Nothing reveals a lack of affection more clearly than the inability to be moved by another person's suffering. Some people can watch you cry and still talk about themselves, or respond with phrases like, "Don't exaggerate," or "It'll pass," without realizing those words are like closing a door in the middle of a storm. Indifference to someone else's pain isn't strength, it's disconnection. And when it comes from someone we love, it feels like deep emotional abandonment because it invalidates the most human part of any bond, empathy. Up to this point, we've talked about the most visible signs of disinterest: lack of attention, absence of reciprocity, and inconsistency between words and actions. But this one, indifference to pain, is a different kind of wound. It doesn't hurt because of what the other person does, but because of what they fail to do. It's looking at someone who once felt like home and realizing they can no longer or no longer want to, stand with you in your pain. In that moment, something within the soul pulls back, not out of punishment, but because it understands that emotional trust has quietly broken. I remember a simple story I once heard. A woman said that after losing her mother, her best friend told her, "Don't cry so much, you need to be strong." She didn't get angry, but when she got home, she realized that strength isn't always about not crying. It's about allowing tears to flow without shame. That well-intentioned but cold remark created a distance. She understood that her friend couldn't offer emotional presence. From then on, she chose to share her pain only where there was listening, not judgment. Empathy doesn't mean fixing another person's pain. It means staying present without running away. Marcus Aurelius put it beautifully: "Be human among humans. Nothing that others suffer is foreign to you." Someone who truly cares doesn't need grand gestures. It's enough that they stay a moment in silence, listen without interrupting, say, "I'm here with you," and mean it. Because sometimes a single act of presence is worth more than 1,000 rushed pieces of advice. Psychology shows that when pain isn't validated, it intensifies. It's like covering a wound without cleaning it. It looks closed, but inside, it's still infected. That's why indifference to someone's suffering creates a double wound, one from what happened and another from the loneliness of not being understood. Learning to recognize this kind of relationship is essential for emotional well-being, because where there's no empathy, there can be no mutual growth. And yet, there's something deeply freeing about recognizing this sign. It reminds us that others aren't obligated to understand us, but we are responsible for surrounding ourselves with those who can. Maturity isn't about demanding comfort, it's about offering it where there's reciprocity. Once you understand this, you stop begging for empathy and start cultivating it within yourself. And with that clarity, another door opens, a form of disinterest even more evident, not in everyday moments, but in the critical ones. Because some absences hurt more than cold words, they're the ones that happen right when we need company the most. There are silences that weigh more than any offense. Those moments when you're going through a crisis, an illness, a loss, and you wait for a call, a message, a hand to hold, but it doesn't come. That absence, in the moments when you need company the most, reveals an uncomfortable truth. Not everyone who says they love you is willing to walk with you through the dark. And though it's hard to accept, genuine care is measured in difficult times, not in easy ones. When someone disappears just when you need them most, they don't only leave you alone, they also force you to face your own strength. So far, we've gone through signs that show different shades of disinterest. But this one, the absence in times of pain, is the most revealing because it can't be faked. No one can hide their lack of commitment when the other person is suffering. Those who truly care show up, even if they don't know what to say. Those who don't find an excuse. Sometimes they'll say, "I didn't want to bother you," or "I thought you needed space." And maybe that's true, but real affection looks for a way, not a way out. I remember a story that stayed with me. An elderly woman once told me that after a complicated surgery, she waited days for her son to visit. He didn't come. When he finally showed up, he did so in a hurry, saying work had kept him too busy. She simply smiled and replied calmly, "Don't worry, I've learned to heal on my own too." That phrase, spoken without bitterness, held a Stoic lesson within it: not to depend on someone else's care to preserve your own dignity. The absence hurt, yes, but it also made her stronger. From a Stoic perspective, another person's absence is an opportunity to practice inner mastery. Seneca said that the wise person expects nothing from anyone, yet deeply values those who are there. Not because they're indifferent, but because they understand that life doesn't guarantee reciprocity, and still choose to love. Learning to be at peace with what doesn't arrive is one of the hardest yet most freeing lessons, because the one who no longer depends on external comfort finds refuge in their own calm. Psychologically, this kind of abandonment often awakens old wounds, the child who once waited for someone to come save them. That's why absence doesn't just hurt in the present, it reopens fears from the past. But when you learn to hold yourself, when you can find peace even in the emptiness, the wound stops being punishment and becomes a teacher. That's where true emotional independence begins, not the kind that denies affection, but the kind that doesn't beg for it. The practice here isn't to harden your heart, but to observe who shows up when there's no light left, when there's nothing to offer but your vulnerability. Those are the connections that matter, the ones that stay when everyone else leaves. And when you can recognize those who hold you without expecting anything in return, absence stops being pain and becomes a filter. And from this understanding emerges another, subtler but equally clear sign of disinterest. When the other person doesn't disappear physically, but loses all genuine interest in your life, your joys, and the things that matter to you. Because sometimes they don't really leave, they just stop being present. Some relationships seem to remain intact on the surface, but the other person is no longer truly there. The greetings continue, the routine messages, the polite conversations, but something has been lost. Curiosity about your world. This is one of the saddest signs of disinterest because it doesn't happen suddenly. It fades slowly over time. They no longer ask how your project is going, don't remember important dates, don't celebrate your small victories. What used to be conversation has turned into obligation. And while the bond still exists, its soul is gone. So far, we've talked about absences and silences, but this kind of disconnection is colder. It happens while the other person is still physically present. There are no arguments or visible distance, yet you can feel an invisible wall. The words become generic, the replies short, the attention scattered. You realize you're speaking alone, trying to keep alive a conversation that the other person has already abandoned internally. And that's the difference between sharing time and sharing life. Seneca said that paying attention is the highest form of generosity. Not everyone has that ability because it requires presence, listening, and emotional memory. Someone who truly cares about you remembers what you said, asks later how it went, shows interest in what excites or worries you. It's not about routine, it's about affection. On the other hand, someone who isn't interested in your life doesn't listen to understand, but just to respond quickly and move back to their own world. In psychology, this pattern is linked to superficial relationships, where the other person has no intention of building a deep, emotional connection. They might stay out of habit, convenience, or fear of loneliness, but not genuine care, and you can feel it. Because when someone values you, their curiosity doesn't fade. They want to know you in your nuances, your changes, your silences. When curiosity disappears, indifference hides behind normality. There's a simple practice that can help you observe this without resentment. The next time you talk to someone close, notice whether they ask about you or only talk about themselves. Not to judge them, but to understand the true dynamic of the bond. If you realize you're the one carrying most of the conversation, maybe it's time to ask yourself why you keep holding it up. Silence, too, can be an answer. Stoicism teaches us to let go without bitterness what no longer has life. To accept that some relationships only made sense for a stretch of the road, and that insisting on keeping them alive is like watering a plastic plant. It doesn't grow, it just wears you out. When you learn to release relationships where interest has faded, you begin to find time and energy for those who truly care, for those who ask with attention and listen with heart. And from that understanding arises an even more painful form of indifference. when the other person not only stops caring, but also minimizes what you feel, as if your emotions were exaggerations or whims. Because there's no greater disinterest than the one that invalidates your inner world. There are phrases that don't shout, but they wound. You're overreacting. It's not that big a deal. There are people who have it worse. Behind those words hides one of the clearest signs that someone doesn't truly care about you, when they don't make room for what you feel. Minimizing your emotions doesn't just shut down the conversation, it shuts down trust. Because how can you open your heart to someone who judges it? Emotional invalidation is a subtle form of disinterest that leaves deep scars. It teaches you to stay silent, to distrust, and to doubt your own perception. So far, we've seen how disinterest shows up through absence, silence, and indifference. But when someone denies the value of your emotions, the damage turns inward. You start to feel like you're too sensitive, that you should toughen up, and you end up suppressing what actually needs to be heard. This pattern often repeats in relationships where the other person fears vulnerability or needs to stay in control. Deep down, those who minimize your feelings don't want to face the depth of connection because doing so would require them to truly show up. Psychology explains this clearly. Invalidating emotions is a form of emotional distancing. It protects the one who uses it, but wounds the one who receives it. Over time, this dynamic creates disconnection. It's as if every time you share something, the other person builds an invisible wall that bounces your words back without empathy. There's no space for pain, nor for joy, only a cold surface where the soul echoes. I once read a story that illustrates this perfectly. A wise man listened to his apprentice complain about a friend who treated him with disdain. The sage told him, "When someone says what you feel doesn't matter, look at them with compassion. They're showing you their limit, not your worth." That lesson captures a profound truth. Not everyone is capable of emotional presence, and that doesn't make your feelings any less valid. From a Stoic perspective, Marcus Aurelius urged us to distinguish between what depends on us and what doesn't. You can't control how someone else receives your emotions, but you can decide who you share them with. And that's essential. Not everyone deserves access to your vulnerability. Some will only use it to feel superior or to create distance. Protecting what you feel isn't pride, it's wisdom. Ask yourself, how many times have you downplayed your own pain just to avoid making someone uncomfortable? That's the seed of inner disconnection. Healing begins when you start listening to your own voice again, when you allow yourself to feel without asking permission. Sensitivity isn't weakness, it's the mark of an awakened mind. And from this understanding emerges another equally clear sign, when a relationship isn't based on empathy or understanding, but on convenience. When the other person only approaches you if there's something to gain, some benefit or support. That's one of the coldest forms of disinterest because it reduces the bond to a soulless transaction. There are relationships that only bloom when it benefits the other person. They show up urgently when they need something, but vanish when you're the one in need. And though at first it may look like affection, over time it becomes clear. They're not seeking your company, they're seeking your resources, your attention, your time, your energy. This kind of relationship is one of the most calculated forms of disinterest because it turns affection into a transaction. There's no genuine connection anymore, only usefulness. And the most painful part is that sometimes we accept this disguised exchange out of fear of losing the little that remains. Up to this point, we've seen signs where disinterest reveals itself emotionally, through indifference, lack of reciprocity, or minimization. But here, the relationship becomes instrumental. The person doesn't relate to you for who you are, but for what you provide. You notice it when they only show up with requests, when their tone changes depending on what they need, or when their presence fades as soon as they get what they wanted. And there's no deeper loneliness than realizing you're only loved as long as you're useful. I once heard a simple but powerful story. A man always helped a friend with his financial troubles. Whenever he needed something, he was there. One day, the roles reversed. The man faced a problem and called that same friend. The response was a long silence followed by, "I'm sorry, I can't right now." That was all it took. He realized it wasn't friendship, but a transaction dressed as care. And he understood that when a relationship depends on convenience, loyalty disappears the moment the wind changes direction. Stoicism teaches us to distinguish between what has value and what merely has a price. Seneca wrote that someone who loves out of interest has never truly loved. They've only made a calculation. Authentic relationships are built on virtue, not utility. Someone who truly cares doesn't measure what they gain from your presence. They're simply glad that you exist. In contrast, those who use you as a means reveal they don't see you as a person, but as a resource. From a psychological standpoint, this pattern often appears in narcissistic or dependent relationships, where the other person seeks control, not reciprocity. In these cases, setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's emotional hygiene. Saying no to a relationship based on convenience is an act of inner affirmation, refusing to be treated like an object. And though it may hurt at first, the clarity that follows brings a peace that's priceless. There's one unmistakable way to identify these relationships. Notice what happens when you stop offering what the other person wants. If your usefulness ends and so does their interest, you already have your answer. That absence isn't punishment, it's liberation. It shows you that you didn't lose a relationship, you ended an unequal exchange. And behind that truth lies an even more complex form of disinterest, when the person not only uses you, but also makes you feel guilty for protecting your own boundaries. Because, for those who only think of themselves, your dignity can feel like a threat. There are forms of love that can't stand your freedom. People who only feel comfortable when you give in, stay quiet, and do what they expect. And the moment you set a boundary, guilt appears. You're becoming selfish. You've changed. You don't need me like before. Behind those words hides a subtle manipulation, making you believe that taking care of yourself is an act of betrayal. But it isn't. Setting boundaries doesn't drive away those who love you, it drives away those who benefited from your lack of them. So far, we've seen signs of disinterest expressed through indifference, convenience, and lack of empathy. But this one is different. Here, the other person reacts, but with reproach. Because when they can no longer control you, they try to make you feel guilty. That's the real essence of disinterest. They don't care how you feel, only how your choices affect their comfort. It's not wounded love, it's wounded ego. Stoicism teaches that no one can steal your peace without your consent. Epictetus said, "No one can harm you unless you allow it." That lesson becomes crystal clear in relationships where guilt is used as a tool. Every time someone blames you for setting a boundary, they're showing you which part of the relationship depended on your submission. Recognizing that isn't coldness, it's clarity. Because when a relationship only survives if you give yourself up, it's no longer love, it's control. Psychologically, this kind of manipulation is known as induced guilt. It's a tactic meant to push you back into the role of the self-sacrificing one. It works by appealing to your empathy. "You're making me feel bad. After everything I've done for you, I didn't expect this from you." These phrases appeal to duty and the fear of disappointing others. But behind them, there isn't love, only a need for control. And no one can truly love while needing to dominate. There's a simple image to keep in mind: a mirror. When you set a boundary, the other person sees themselves reflected in it. If they're at peace, they'll understand. If not, they'll project their discomfort onto you. What they say about you in that moment reveals more about their shadows than your decisions. So instead of arguing, observe. Don't defend yourself against guilt that isn't yours. Setting boundaries isn't closing your heart, it's protecting it. It's saying, this yes, this no, with calmness and conviction. It's recognizing that inner peace is worth more than external approval. And when you do it peacefully, not out of anger, something aligns within you. You begin to see who stays because they respect you and who leaves because they only loved you when you were compliant. Both are valuable lessons. The first gives you genuine companionship. The second teaches you how to let go without resentment. And now we reach the final sign, perhaps the most revealing of all. Because if someone can't be happy for your successes, if your growth bothers or threatens them, then it's no longer disinterest, it's envy disguised as indifference. The ultimate test of who's truly with you and who only was as long as you needed their approval. Some people disappear when you succeed. They can't stand to see you shine, even if they swear they love you. When you achieve something, they go silent, change the subject, or even downplay it. And that hurts more than it seems, because genuine affection doesn't fear another's joy. It celebrates it. When someone can't be happy for you, what they're really showing is emotional distance or insecurity. Indifference toward your achievements is a clear sign that the connection is no longer sincere but marked by comparison or detachment. So far, we've talked about how disinterest appears through a lack of empathy, convenience, or guilt. But this final sign closes the circle. It reveals who truly walks beside you and who only did while you needed support. Celebrating someone else's success is one of the purest expressions of love because it means feeling joy without personal gain. Not everyone can do that because for many, another's happiness reminds them of what they haven't achieved. But that's not your problem, nor your fault. I once heard a woman say during a practical philosophy workshop, "When I started getting better, some friends drifted away. It was easier for them to share my sadness than my growth." That sentence stayed with me. Sometimes growth becomes a kind of farewell, not because you leave, but because the other person no longer knows how to connect with your new self. But that too is a blessing. It shows you who was with you out of affection and who was there out of need. Stoicism teaches us not to depend on external validation. Marcus Aurelius said, "Do what is right even if no one praises you." And yet, it's also true that sharing joy is a deeply human act. We don't seek approval, we seek connection. That's why when someone genuinely rejoices for you, that gesture means more than 1,000 words. It's proof that the bond is pure, free from competition or resentment. In practice, one of the best ways to recognize who truly cares is to observe how they react when things go well for you. Do they cheer you on, celebrate with you, ask how you did it? Or do they change the subject, correct you, or make you feel like you're overdoing it? Mature love doesn't compete, it collaborates. It isn't threatened by your evolution, it's inspired by it. And once you understand that, you stop seeking approval from those who can't give it and start cherishing the spaces where your growth is welcomed. This final sign isn't meant to breed distrust, but awareness. It's not about suspicion, it's about clarity. Someone who doesn't celebrate your victories doesn't necessarily wish you harm, but they do show emotional distance. Be grateful for the lesson and release the expectation. Life will always bring to your side those who can rejoice with you sincerely, without measuring. And with this final understanding, the journey through these signs comes to an end. Behind each one lies the same message: to protect your peace and your dignity without hardening your heart, to see clearly without resentment, and to choose without guilt. Because when you recognize who doesn't truly care about you, you create space for those who will. with tenderness, honesty, and no conditions. Throughout this journey, we've explored 10 signs that, though painful, carry a quiet power, the power of clarity, disinterest, lack of reciprocity, empty promises, indifference to your pain, absence in difficult times, lack of genuine interest in your life, minimization of your emotions, convenience, guilt for setting boundaries, and the inability to celebrate your successes. Each one reveals a different form of disconnection, but all point to the same truth. You can't make someone care about you, but you can choose who receives your attention and your energy. Recognizing these signs doesn't make you distrustful, it makes you aware. And awareness is always the first step toward inner freedom. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Your presence on the other side of this conversation is proof that there are still people willing to look within honestly, to learn without bitterness, and to grow without losing tenderness. This space exists because of you and with you. Every comment, every word you share sustains the purpose that unites us, learning to live with dignity and serenity even when others don't change. Because true power doesn't lie in controlling others, it lies in cultivating peace within yourself. My name is Gabriel, and my mission is to remind you again and again that protecting your peace isn't selfishness, it's responsibility. Serenity doesn't come when everything is perfect, but when you stop negotiating your well-being with others. That's the promise of this path. To learn to care for yourself without closing your heart, to choose relationships that nourish you, and to honor your own company as the safest refuge. Before we part ways, I'd like to ask you something. Tell me which country you're listening from and write this phrase in the comments to seal today's reflection. I live with wisdom. Share this with someone who might be confused, still looking for signs where there are none. Maybe this message is exactly what they need. Thank you for staying until the end, for your time, and for your presence. Up next, you'll see 2 videos on screen. Choose one and keep deepening this path of growth and wisdom. We'll meet again soon with the same calm, the same purpose, and a heart a little freer than before.